Welcome, everyone, to part two of a two-part series on academic standards and how they drive instruction. This part two that we're doing today, by the way, part one was in October, and we'll have a link to the video and all the links we share today if you didn't missed it. But don't worry if you missed it. This is some new stuff, and you'll be just fine. I want to start with some introductions. We have 4 members of the MDE Academic Standards Team here today, but we're super happy that we are partnering with 4 teacher organizations in the state of Minnesota. I'm going to start us out, introduce myself, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and then we'll get started with today's session. My name is Sara Werf, and I am the MDE Math Specialist for the state, and I am excited to be partnering with MCTM, the Minnesota Council of Teachers of Mathematics, who will be hosting this webinar on their website, and other organizations will be linking to that in their areas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristin Bauck. I'm the English Language Arts Specialist with MDE, and our Minnesota Council Teachers of English professional organization co-sponsors these academic webinar series.
Hi everyone, my name is Angie, Kolonich, and Ojibwe one. My name is Gijik Matigakwe. I'm the Science Education Specialist here at MDE, and I'm very thankful to be co-sponsored, our webinar to be co-sponsored by the Minnesota Science Teachers Association. So thank you, MNSTA.
And I'm bringing up the rear, Sara Carter, STEM and Computer Science Integration Specialist, and super excited to jump into this series to talk about computer science and computational thinking, and the CSTA, the Computer Science Teachers Association Minnesota chapter, is also jumping in to support the work.
So today we are going to talk about how to integrate computer science into our content standards. As always, when we do a session, we are going to start with MDE's 10 commitments to equity. Specifically today, we're looking at number 7 and number 9 highlighted in white. It's very important to us at MDE that we monitor the implementation of standards. In fact, that's the work of the team that we all work on. And it's super important as we think about how in number 9 we can improve the conditions for learning for all K-12 Minnesota students, that we bring special attention to not only our content standards, but the computer science standards that are integrated into our standards so that all of our students have equitable access and have opportunities when they leave the K-12 system. So today, we have 2 things that we're trying to accomplish. Number 1, we're trying to look at what is computational thinking. And so you're going to be working with Sara Carter to engage in a computational thinking activity. And then number 2, you're going to hear from the other 3 of us, and we're going to give you examples of how computational thinking shows up in each of our areas and how you can integrate it into the work of our content areas. And so you'll hear from ELA, science, and math about what's going on. Today, everything that we're sharing with you can be found in the links that we're sharing in the chat. But you can also find links from our previous webinar. We'll share this QR code in the bit.ly at the end of our session. But we're super hopeful that you will also share this with people who aren't here today and get these links out to them as well. As we're thinking about what we did last time in session 1 in October, we talked about how standards drive the work of K-12 academics. You'll see this graphic at the end, but we're going to add a new gear to it. In the first session, we talked about how academic standards drive the curricular resources that you select and help inform how you're going to think about those decision-making along with other decisions that you make around instruction in K-12 academics. What we're in that session, we asked you to consider taking a first step towards centering academic standards in the decision-making in your school. I'm not going to read all 6 of these, but if you did not attend that webinar in October, I'd encourage you to go back and watch it. We have a link for it in all those links that I talked about before. And ask yourself, which one of these 6 things do I want to engage in? If you were there, hold yourself accountable. Have you engaged in one of these 6 things? And if not, today's a new day. You can start the best, next best thing from not doing it is to start today. What we are going to do at the end of this session on the next slide is we're going to give you 4 different Kristin, can you go forward one slide? We're going to give you 4 things to consider around computational thinking. So this time there's only 4, not 6. We'll tell you what those 4 things are, and we're going to ask you to just pick one of them and take a small step towards integrating computational thinking. As we're getting ready to start on the next slide, you will see us. Oh, I'm seeing stuff in the chat. And so if there's something going on, I'll take a look at that as soon as I'm done, because I'm going to turn it over to Sara Carter, and she's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Sara. So we've been talking about computational thinking. And just before we start, I want to just emphasize that computational thinking is a part of computer science. We're going to focus on computational thinking today, but they're both really connected. So you're going to hear both the terms computer science and computational thinking. So why are we talking about computer science? So the reason we're talking about computer science in the Minnesota Academic Standards is in the revised standards for science, ELA, math, and health, which is currently in development, include integrations of computer science at the benchmark level. So those committees looked at connections between their content area and computer science, using national computer science standards to see where there was overlap between the content areas. And when they saw that, they marked the benchmarks so that you can think about where you can find some integration. So in science, those benchmarks are marked with a double asterisk. In English language arts, they are marked with a single asterisk. And in mathematics, they are marked with a hashtag or £, depending on your age. So that's why we're talking about it. I do want to iterate a couple of things, which is having computer science integrated into the Minnesota Academic Standards does not mean that we don't need computer science in K-12 education. We do. And I can go on for hours about the importance of computer science education in schools, but I won't right now. I'm just going to say that where we have computer science integrated is a great place to start, and you can always go further. And we're going to have some of the examples we look at today are going to go a little bit further into thinking about how computational thinking can be integrated into the benchmarks beyond what is marked, what was marked by the committee. So go ahead to the next slide. We're going to talk about some definitions before we dive in. So I first want to start with computer science. So I'll just take a second for folks to read the definition on the slide. And would love to folks in the chat just to drop in, what are some words that are sticking out to you, drawing your attention, either because you see connections to them or you're wondering, what does this mean in the computer science context? Go ahead and drop some words in the chat. What's sticking out to you? Algorithmic processes, impact on society. Yeah, lots of algorithm and impacts on society. Yep. So algorithm is a really interesting word that has different definitions in different content areas. And when we're talking about it in computer science, and I'll get more into this later, we're talking about a set of step-by-step directions that's often used as part of programming. It makes computers do what they do by people developing algorithmic processes and telling the computer what they are. So this is a really jargony definition, but essentially we're looking at computers, how they work, how they are programmed, how they talk to each other, and what I think, and folks brought up in the chat is really interesting, also their impact on society, how they're used and their impact on society. So this is just kind of a general definition of computer science. So then we also talk about computational thinking practices. Computational thinking is the problem-solving process that we go through in computer science, but you'll also see that it has many connections across content areas. This is super tiny. You're not meant to be able to read this, but this poster, Sara included a link to. You can find it on the CS website. Talks about all the different computational thinking practices. I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are the 6 computational thinking practices that we have kind of highlighted. Different organizations highlight different practices. There isn't really one kind of authority list of them, but just talking through them real quickly. So decomposition is when we take a problem and we break it down into parts. We decompose it. And I know decomposition has lots of meanings in other content areas. ELA, science, and math all have their own definitions of decomposition, but they all kind of mean the same thing, where we're taking something and we're breaking it into smaller parts. Whether we're talking about decaying dead animals in science, or we're talking about taking apart a math problem. And then in pattern recognition, that's kind of self-explanatory. We are recognizing patterns and repeating them. Algorithms, as I said earlier, is just a set of steps. At the elementary, early kindergarten age, we can talk about what is the algorithm for brushing your teeth or getting ready to go outside for recess. What are the steps that we follow? Abstraction is when we're taking something and we're abstracting it to its most simplest state. So in that image, we have 3 circles. They're all the same size, but they're different colors. Some of them have inside rings. But when we abstract out all the details, they are all just circles, right? So we're taking away the extraneous details and paying attention to what is the most important information in there. And the fact that is that they're all circles. We also in computer science are looking at data. I mean, this is why computers were created, to crunch big sets of data. And then finally, we're looking at evaluation and impact. So evaluating how computational artifacts are doing or not doing what they were intended to do, and the impacts of the creation of those. So we're going to get a chance to practice some of these computational thinking practices by doing a little activity. So I'm going to ask everybody, we'll put a link in the chat to go to a tool, and go ahead and click on this link. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to kind of play with this tool, get comfortable with it, figure out what it does. In particular, look at how you can drag those pattern block shapes onto the screen, how you can move them around, delete them, play with them. So go ahead, click on that link that Sara put in the chat, and I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to get kind of comfortable playing with the tool.
And if you're watching the recording, the link is in the description, and we'd love for you to play along as well.
About 10 more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to clear out what you were making. So delete all those shapes on your screen. And the challenge I'm going to give you is using those shapes. So no drawing or using any other tools, just use those shapes. Create a duck using those shapes. I'm going to give you about 90 seconds to create that duck. And then we're going to share our duck images on a Padlet so we can take a look at them all together. So about a minute and a half to create your duck using those pattern shapes. Go ahead and get started.
And I'm not going to model this one, because we all want to make our own ducks, and 2, that's not my skill set. So I want to see all the ducks that you all make.
about 30 more seconds to work on your duck. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to stop working on your duck. And just real quick, Kristin's going to show us how to grab a screenshot. I'm going to ask you to grab a screenshot of your picture, whatever you ended up creating, and you're going to upload it. Ooh, I think that's the wrong link, Sara. Upload it to the Padlet so we can see. There you go. So you can copy an image. And you're going to upload it to the Padlet by clicking on the little plus, and then you can go ahead and paste your image in, and we should start to see some ducks show up. We're going to have a quick chat about those ducks once we start seeing them on the page. Right, I see people joining the Padlet. See, Marta's got her duck up there.
Ooh, I love the ducks.
Yep. Well, Compassionate Caterpillars got there. So as these ducks are popping up, I want you to think about, what do they have in common? What are we seeing showing up in some of these that seem common? You can feel free to unmute or type in the chat. What are some things that you notice across our ducks that are similar? Alice, once you've grabbed a screenshot of your duck on the Padlet, in the bottom right corner, there's a little yellow plus. And if you click on that plus, you can either attach if you've saved it, or paste if you just did a copy. So I see Marta's noticing a lot of them have beaks and 2 feet. Yeah, yellow ducks with orange beaks. What else do you notice across our ducks that they have in common? Well, Stephanie, we all need practice with duck making skills. Yes, I see Amy saying most are side view. Yeah, interestingly, when I've done this activity many times, and almost always we've got side view. This time I see we don't have them all side view, which I think is great to see. We see lots of side view ducks. Anything else you notice? Simplified. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Simplified. So, as we're looking at these, yes, we definitely have a great straight on duck. As you're looking at these, think back to those computational thinking practices. Which of those computational thinking practices are we engaging in as we make these ducks? So there's some clues into some of the comments that have been in the chat as well. Yeah, so big one is abstraction. We were thinking about, okay, what are the most important parts of a duck? And as you can see from most of our pictures, beaks are very important. Everybody has beaks. Feet are very important, right? What other things did we do? Yeah, I see Laura talking about decomposition. So once again, breaking that duck down into its parts, right? And then abstracting out those parts. Mike's mentioning pattern recognition. So if we think about like my friends that are really good birders and can recognize all manner of ducks. There are so many different kinds of like waterfowl in general. And we're looking for patterns, right? They have kind of a body shape, a beak shape, of like 2 feet, right? So what are the patterns that we notice? Yeah. So this is a really good example of talking about computational thinking without a computer. I mean, yes, we use a computer, but we aren't doing any programming. We aren't necessarily like thinking about what might stereotypically be part of computer science, but we are practicing some of those computational thinking skills in a way that we might tangentially, I think Sara would say, connect to math in this example, because we're using pattern blocks, right? This is also really fun to do with coworkers, with your students. If you have actual pattern blocks in your classroom, like I used to as a 5th and 6th grade teacher, I could have my students make ducks with the actual physical pattern blocks. So just wanted to give you an example of what some of those computational thinking practices look like in action. I am going to hand it over to my colleagues to talk about the connections they see between one of the computational thinking practices and their content area. And as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of different connections we can make. This is just a starting point. So I will start by handing it off to Kristin.
Thanks, Sara. I'm going to be focusing on abstraction today and how that connects to English language arts. I'll first start by mentioning that we have a learning progressions document of all of the computer science integrated benchmarks for ELA that you can download. Sara just put a copy in the chat and it's in our document for today. And these are marked with an asterisk, and you can see that sometimes there is a benchmark for almost every single grade level that connects to computer science, like you can see here on the left. And then other times it really shows up in certain grade levels, and that's because the computer science standard gets more complex as the grades go higher and doesn't necessarily match English language arts as much as it might in earlier grades. You'll also probably notice that a lot of the computer science integrated benchmarks fall in our media literacy anchor standards in both reading, writing, and exchanging ideas. And we've been talking about media literacy a lot in our English language arts community. So definitely reach out to me if you would like to talk more about media literacy specifically. Today, I'm actually focusing on a computational thinking practice that isn't necessarily part of our computer science integrated benchmarks. And I did that intentionally to demonstrate that the computer science benchmarks are just the starting point for how you can connect computational thinking to our work and thinking a little bit outside of the box with our English language arts example. So abstraction is reducing complexity to focus on the most important parts. For example, creating generalizations or representations. And I'm going to highlight 2 aspects of ELA, one about generalizations and one about representation. So the first example, as I mentioned, is around creating generalizations. And the way that we often do this in ELA is through summarizing. Summarizing is probably a skill that comes first to mind when you think about some of the main skills in English language arts. We ask students to practice it from very young ages up through really complex summarizing. And summarizing is an act of generalizing all of the details in a text into the most essential parts that you can then share with someone else. We can see a few examples of summarizing in this anchor standard. So it really shows up in anchor standard 4, which is read critically to comprehend, interpret, and analyze themes and central ideas in complex literary and informational texts. And in order to interpret and analyze, we have to comprehend. Summarizing is one of the ways that we often can demonstrate our comprehension. And you can see here just some of those early grades. We scaffold up that summarizing skill from retelling key details to recounting the text to summarizing the text. I'm going to share 2 strategies for getting to that generalization of text through summary on this slide. And both of these come from Kylene Beers and Bob Prost's work in Notice and Note. And they're really helpful tools that you can use with students to work on this skill. The first on the left is for summarizing fiction. It's called Somebody Wanted But So, and then some people add the then at the end. So somebody wanted, but so, and then. And in those words, you can really summarize a complex narrative work from a short story to a novel. When we identify somebody, we're asking who is the character. In this case, a lion, a shark, a wolf. Always in narrative, our character wants something. So in this case, what did they want? They wanted to be liked by the other animals. But what made this difficult? Everyone feared them because they were carnivores. This is a retelling of a picture book. So, how did the character deal with the conflict? They decided to become vegetarians and resist their urges, but they failed at each attempt. And then how did it conclude? Then how did the story end? They met an owl who told them that eating meat doesn't make them bad. That's just who they are. And they returned to their predatory ways. This is not meant to be a statement about any of particular food choices, just an example of summarizing. So somebody wanted, but so then is an example of how we can abstract text into its generalization of summary. The nonfiction example has some steps, has students read the text, identify text structure, which is always important and especially important in informational because there's many different kinds of informational text structures. And then you unlock that main idea sentence by identifying the text, the verb, the topic, and the big idea. So in this example, the text was a lesson. So it says, in this lesson, the author examines, that's the verb, the topic, our global economy, and then explains how it is a result of communication and transportation. That distilled or abstracted a pretty complex topic into one sentence. You could then have students identify 2 or 3 important details from the text and then write a full paragraph, which you're welcome to read on your own or in your copy of the slides. So both of those are examples of how we can use summarizing strategies to generalize text. The second example I want to share is around figurative language. And this is an element of abstraction that asks students to create representations. Figurative language is always a representation of something else. That is what makes it figurative. And so we're not talking necessarily about the kinds of representations of ducks that we did earlier, but a linguistic representation. And so we have Reading Anchor Standard 8, which is examining the impact of vocabulary, including words and phrases, on content, style, and meaning of complex literary and informational texts. And then you can see we've got the 3rd through 7th grade benchmarks highlighted here, and we have students distinguish literal from figurative language, understand connotative and denotative meaning, and then let's see, look at rhythm, meter, figurative and connotative meanings. And here is just an example of some of the most common figurative language elements that we teach in English language arts. Simile and metaphor are probably the 2 that most directly connect to the concept of generalization, but the other ones do as well. So a simile, if you recall your own learning, is a comparison or 2 unlike things using like or as. So we have here that my brothers are as loud as cymbals clanging together. And so that is a representation of the noise, right? It isn't describing the noise, it's a figurative representation of it. Metaphor is a comparison of 2 unlike things that says one thing is another. And so the new baby was a bundle of joy. That's a representation of that baby. We've got other kinds of figurative language here too, like personification, I think is one of my favorites, where we represent emotions of non-human objects through human qualities. So you can take a look at the rest of this list of figurative language, but I thought that this was a strong connection for the representation piece of abstraction in English language arts. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague to talk about data and science.
Thanks, Kristin. So thank you. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the practice of computational thinking that Kristin mentioned, data. And the reason I selected data to talk about in science today is that it might seem like the obvious overlap. Like we already have a practice for analyzing and interpreting data in science, so it can be really easy to think, oh, I already do that. But obvious doesn't always mean easy. And so I think that it's really important to take an intentional look at our benchmarks. Particularly today, I chose to focus on areas where we do have that computer science integration and think to ourselves, how are we working beyond the requirements of like our science and engineering practices and really getting into those practices for computational thinking, for example. So for looking at data. So how can we push it beyond a little bit? And so one really exciting thing about science, our Minnesota science standards went into full implementation this year. And I know that folks on the call are not all science educators, and so I'm going to give just a really brief structural background for our benchmarks since we're going to look at a few benchmarks together today. So one of the shifts in our 2019 science standards is that we are hoping to shift students to really figuring out their own science and not just learning about science that other people figured out a long time ago. And so one of the structural components of our standards that aligns to that first is that we have students starting each lesson and unit with exploration of observable phenomena. So things that they can look at, question about, notice and wonder, and then use what we call the 3 dimensions of science to either, develop an explanation for that phenomena or solve problems. And so the 3 dimensions that are present in all of our benchmarks represented here are science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas. And one other important aspect of our standards is that sophistication, I guess, in all of these dimensions progresses across the K-12 spectrum. So we want students to be learning about, for example, analyzing and interpreting data all the way from kindergarten to 12th grade. And so I really wanted to focus on that progression of data today in the benchmarks we're going to look at. But first, we'll take a little bit closer look at each of these dimensions. If you could go to the next slide. So the first dimension, big core ideas in science. So they're represented here. This is mostly what people think of when they think of science content. And we have each of the broad domain areas here. So physical sciences, life sciences, earth and space sciences, and then also engineering, technology, and applications of science. So there's always an aspect of this in every single benchmark from kindergarten to grade 12. Next slide. The second dimension is our cross-cutting concepts, and already you're probably seeing words that would be really familiar to you just thinking about computer science in general, or any of the other disciplines that we're talking about here today. So one is patterns. We talk about patterns in multiple content areas and across the science spectrum. Also, cause and effect relationships is another one that you might see a lot today. And definitely systems and system models is something very aligned with work in computer science. And so looking at our science and engineering practices here, so these are the practices that students engage in every single day. It's their actual doing of science. And I've highlighted 2 of the practices here. So the 2 practices I've highlighted are analyzing and interpreting data and using mathematics and computational thinking. So these are the 2 practices, the 2 areas where we primarily see use of that data practice showing up. And just as a reminder, when we engage in analyzing and interpreting data, whether it's for science or as part of computational thinking, that includes gathering data, organizing data, analyzing data, and also presenting data. So it can include all of those things. So I've selected 3 benchmarks for us to look at today, one in elementary, one in middle, one in high school. Each one of these benchmarks is one of our computer science integrated benchmarks and has a focus on data. And I'd really like you to think about, as we look at these benchmarks together, how that practice of data kind of becomes more sophisticated or more in depth as we move from elementary school to middle school to high school. I did also try to select one from each of the domains. So we have an earth and space science benchmark, a life science benchmark, and also a high school chemistry benchmark. So we'll look at those together today. So the first one here, this is a 3rd grade earth and space science benchmark that says organize and electronically present collected data to identify and describe patterns in the amount of daylight in different times of the year. And so this benchmark goes beyond just having students look at the number of minutes in a day in the fall or in the winter, and asks them to think about data visualization. So they are going to electronically present this data using some type of digital tool. We can move to the next slide. So the second benchmark is a 7th grade life science benchmark. And this one here says, analyze and interpret data to provide evidence for the effects of resource availability on organisms and populations of organisms in an ecosystem. So for this benchmark, students might develop a systems model of a particular ecosystem. Maybe they could use a digital tool that allows them to manipulate some variables, and they could change the resource availability and then collect evidence to see what happens across that ecosystem over time. Move to the next slide. And then our high school computer science benchmark that I've selected says develop a data simulation. So already hopefully you can see this progression over time. So now they're developing a data simulation based on observations and experimental data of how pressure, volume, temperature, and mass of a gas are related to each other to predict the effect on a system of changing one of those variables. So they might use a particular software to develop their own data simulation and work with that. Next slide, please. So sometimes I get the question of, how do I select curriculum that's aligned to these computer science integrated benchmarks? How do I know where or how to develop my own curriculum to go along with curriculum maybe my school district already adopted? And the advice we really have for you is to start with the standards. Really look at those benchmarks, dig into them, and try to think about where all of these practices are showing up, how to extend, what might already be happening as a result of our science and engineering practices, and develop a deep understanding of what's in those benchmarks. It's really most important that materials support good instructional practices. In science, that means starting with presenting phenomena and helping students develop skills in all 3 dimensions and in computer science as well. And then once you've reviewed the materials, you can always develop supplemental materials to address any gaps that you see in that. And with that, I am going to transfer it over to my colleague Sara to talk about decomposition in mathematics.
I love all 6 of the computational things. You could download that poster. So I just chose number 1 because this word shows up in the math standards. I'll show you where in a few minutes. But one of the easiest ways to embed computational thinking into any of our subject areas is to start using the language of computational thinking, both with the other adults in our system, but also with our students. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of ideas of how this shows up in mathematics. But first, let me give you a definition. Decomposition, as Sara Carter said, is breaking down a problem or a system, and I'm going to be talking about math systems, into smaller parts. As I said earlier, we don't only break it down, we like to put them back together. We like to recompose them in math. And students who can do that are going to be more skilled than other math students. So I think it's really important for you to see examples of this. So I'm going to give you 4 examples in mathematics. I'm going to start in the K2 area, and I'm going to end in Algebra 2 at the end. So in K2, students are adding 2-digit numbers, and one way for them to think about adding those is to break them down into parts that will make it easier for them. 87 can be recomposed with 13 to make 100. You can see that 38 got broken down into 13 and 25. It was decomposed, and then we recompose it to make a number like 100 that's easy to add to 25. A second example is when we get to 3rd and 4th grade and we're thinking about our multiplication facts and we're visualizing that with arrays. A lot of students can't remember what 6 times 7 is, but they can remember half of that. They can break that apart, and they often remember 3 times 7 is 21, and then they can double that. So students who can decompose something they're trying to figure out into smaller chunks where they already know become more flexible in mathematics. Doubling is an easy thing for a lot of students. Third example is when you get to 5th grade and 6th grade, and you're thinking about taking improper fractions and making mixed fractions. Well, the way you do that is to decompose that fraction into parts. One part is the whole and the other part is what's left over. And you can put those together to make a mixed fraction. And lastly, as we go up the progression into high school, and I know some of you are freaking out because you're seeing variables, But the skills that students develop in the lower grades, where they're taking things apart to help them solve other problems, shows up when they're factoring trinomials when they get to algebra 2, and they take apart terms, and that allows them to factor it with decomposition, to factor in a different way. And so students who can do this are more flexible in mathematics. And so there's lots of ways that this shows up. I'm going to give you a few other ways that you will see this in mathematics, and all the ways that I'm talking about, like I said, and I know this is super tiny, you can go and read this slide later on, but these are all the benchmarks. If you look really tiny at the beginning, it starts in kindergarten. We use the word compose and decompose, and it goes all the way to the end there. 9 means high school. And you'll see the word used over and over again: decomposition, decompose, compose, composition, and then justifying that step with greater sophistication as we're going on. So let's look at something that's not numbers and see what this looks like in shape. When students are learning how to find the area of a trapezoid, often it's better to connect it to something they already know, how to find the area of a rectangle. And so if you can take a trapezoid and cut off part of it and then move it and transform it and put it somewhere else, all of a sudden we see a rectangle. And students know to find the area of a rectangle is base times height at this point, and they can apply that knowledge to finding the area of a trapezoid. Decomposition in math builds connections between mathematical ideas. Let's continue to see some other ways that this plays out. On MDE's YouTube channel, you'll see a video, and you can start it, Kristin. And in that video, there's a progression. I'm just going to show you a few grades. In the early grades, it starts at kindergarten, but in grade 1, you're simply taking apart shapes and then naming the shapes that you turned it into. Kind of looks like the shapes you were playing with Sara Carter. And there's lots of different ways you can take shapes and take them apart and put them back together to reconfigure other shapes. And so we'll do that in grade 1. If you click forward, you will see in grade, I forget what grade this is, 5, when we're thinking about finding the area of a triangle, there are lots of ways to change that triangle so it looks like something you know. I already talked about this with trapezoids, but you can turn any triangle into a rectangle, and there's multiple ways that you can do that. And if you've ever wondered why the formula for finding the area of a triangle is half base times height, is because triangles are half of rectangles, and you start to see that as you're working. If we go ahead to 8th grade, in 8th grade, you will see us starting to think about the Pythagorean theorem. I don't know if you remember the Pythagorean theorem, but the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And that squared literally means a square off of each of the sides of that triangle. And if we take those squares off of the triangle, we can take the two smaller squares and break them apart and start to look at how we can reconfigure all those pieces into the larger squared. The two smaller squares squared is the sum of the larger square squared. And there's a relationship that can be turned into algebraic expressions and equations that we can then use to justify and prove. If we move on, it's not just shape that we're thinking about. It goes all the way back to the beginning. In K2, all they're doing most of the time is taking 10 and decomposing it into parts. Students who see 10 as 5 plus 5, 4 plus 6, 1 plus 9, 3 plus 7, and so on are more skilled than students that are not. And it's even better if they can take it and break it into 3 or 4 parts and see that that also is 10. What that builds is flexibility to start to solve more sophisticated problems. Flexibility is what leads to fluency. That's our goal, is for students to have fluency. Often when students don't have it, they don't have those skills of decomposition. So we need to name it. We need to use that phrase. We need to celebrate when students are breaking apart numbers and seeing them as equivalent to other numbers, and when they can put them back together. So what should you be doing in your classroom? Well, as you get up in higher grades, start doing that with fractions. Visualize it. Think about all the ways we can take 5/6 apart, 5/1/6, and talk about it, 5/1/8, and how we can do that. Students who can do that can add fractions, subtract fractions, multiply fractions, divide fractions better than other students. Decomposition's flexibility leads to fluency. And that continues as they go on. If you look at this list of why decomposing in math helps students, there's a lot of reasons. I've just been talking about one of them, the second one from the bottom, building flexibility. when you're thinking about numbers and operations and shape, but there are lots of other reasons you can go back and take a look at. I only have a couple minutes to talk to you. I could do a whole 3-day session on decomposition and have us experience that. I'm going to end with a couple things. And the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is my friend, Christopher Danielson. He lives in St. Paul. He's the guy behind Math on a Stick at the State Fair, but he's also an author, and he's written several books about mathematics. And one just came out this year. It's called How Did You Count? And in this book is a whole bunch of pictures. And I'm going to pause. And if you're watching the recording, I want you to do this along with you. If you're watching it live, maybe throw something in the chat. How many spheres are there in this picture, and how did you see it? I'm going to pause, and then I'm going to show you some ways you might have seen it. So how many spheres, and how did you count? So hopefully if you're watching the recording, you paused. I'd love to see a few people throw things in the chat. I prepped some things, and the first things I'm seeing in the chat match the first thing I'm going to show you. A lot of people who see this, but not all, the way they see the number of spheres is they see a square and they see the dimensions of that square, the height of 6 and the width of 6, and they multiply those two things together like I'm seeing in the chat. And so it's not just about the answer 36, it's how they saw it. What's the decomposition that they can put it back together in a whole? But that's not the only way students see this. Marcella in the chat saw it starting in the upper right corner. I don't know if that's what's on the next slide. Let's take a look at another way you could have seen it. I've had people say, I see odd numbers. And one way to see odd numbers is to see in the upper right corner 1, and then see 3, and then see 5, and then see 7, 9, and 11. And if we put all those noticings together, the consecutive odd numbers, and add those up, guess what we get? We get 36 a different way. And as you start to see these things happening, you can start to make equivalencies between one student who sees it one way and another student who sees it another way. Again, that builds flexibility. If you click ahead, you'll see those two expressions on top and on bottom, two different ways of seeing the same picture. And if you click ahead one more time, students who have flexibility can see us decompose those shapes and arrange them in a different way and still have methods that will allow them to still see 36 spheres. These are pictures by my friend Christopher. I asked Christopher for a quote because I know a lot of his book is about decomposition. And on the next slide, I'm going to close with a quote from Christopher Danielson, who's way smarter than I am. Christopher says, decomposition in math relies on noticing various kinds of structure. For example, the transition from arithmetic, like Marcella and some of the other people that I've heard say, hey, there's odd numbers, that's arithmetic, and adding them up. When we move to algebra, we can start to generalize that, what gets into some of the other computational things, and that requires an understanding of the structures, not just having memorized facts. And if we want students who are talented mathematicians who can be hired to engage in doing jobs in the computer sciences, it starts young, where we practice the skills that will lead to that as well. So thank you for thinking about decomposition in math. It is super important. It goes to the definition in our future standards around mathematical rigor. It builds the conceptual understanding that we need to bring equal intensity to, and not just procedural skills and fluencies. And I am going to turn this over now to my colleague, Kristin, to give you some next steps around computational thinking.
Thanks, Sara. I know that Sara put this in the chat earlier, but I just also love learning from my colleagues, and I hope that you all enjoyed that too, about how these computer science and computational thinking practices can show up in our different disciplines. We're going to share some takeaways and things that we hope stick with you after viewing this. So as we mentioned at the beginning, our first webinar focused on how standards drive the work of K-12 academics, intersecting with these other elements, our resources, our student and school populations, evidence-based practices, etc. Then today we talked about computational practices. We shared examples of 3 of these in our disciplines. And what we are encouraging you to do is think about these computational practices as another gear that you can really explicitly and transparently add to your work in teaching and learning We can even visualize this gear here and pick just one of these that you can bring over, maybe decomposition, maybe one of the others, and put into conversation with these other elements. That might mean looking at how your evidence-based practices deal with that particular computational thinking strategy, examining your curricular materials, thinking about your student and school culture, and how all of that works together. And again, it could be any one of these that you pull over into that extra gear. We wanted to share 4 steps that you can take today. And as I'm sharing these, for those who are watching live, I would love you to pick one that you're really going to focus on and share it in the chat as we go. So the first is to review those 6 practices of computational thinking. We've shared a few times the handout that you can download and print that describes each of these. And learning about what those computational thinking practices are is a really good first step. The second is to start small. Select one practice to integrate. That might be a practice that you saw today that's related to one of our disciplines. Maybe you pick one and think about how it relates to all content areas. How does abstraction show up in science and in math, even though we focused on it in ELA today, right? So start small, select one practice to integrate. Learn about that selected practice. And then use the language of the 6 practices in content. Sara mentioned this, and I really appreciate it, that we have to name this learning for ourselves and our students. I think especially when I'm thinking about my example with English language arts, I could teach summarizing all day with never mentioning abstraction. But if I mention abstraction and talk about the ways it connects to computational thinking, that draws the connections for learners and educators across those disciplines. So I'm going to give a pause here for a second and see if you want to pick one of these, those of you who are here with us, that you might start with. They sort of build on each other, but what stands out to you first?
And if you're watching the recording, we would love to put something like comment on the video and tell us what you want to be working on.
Mike says, use the languages of the 6 practices in content. Dana says, starting small. Another starting small. I think we all need to start small. It is the end of May. It is almost summer. I think starting small is a really good place. Downloading that poster and then reviewing the practices with the teachers you work with. I love that. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Sara Carter to talk about some of our additional computer science integration resources.
Yeah, so if this short little foray into thinking about computer science and computational thinking and how it moves across content areas got you really interested into diving into more, we have a Canvas course that you can access from the computer science page. This is a free Canvas course. It's about 5 hours to go through it. It is a good background. I know it says K-5 teachers. It's open for anyone. It's a good background on computer science and computational thinking and how to start thinking about integrating computer science and computational thinking into what you're doing, whether you're an elementary school teacher that is responsible for teaching all the content areas, or you're a subject-specific secondary teacher. It's a good way to start thinking about what are these things and how might it look like to include them, in my content area. And I know today we talked specifically about ELA and math and science. We have conversations about computational thinking and computer science across all content areas. So if you want to think about what it looks like to integrate computer science and computational thinking into other content areas, feel free to reach out to any of our academic standards colleagues. Here's all of their contact information for you to be able to reach out to them. And just another reminder, on the next slide, all of the resources we shared today, including a PDF of this presentation, are available in the folder and available, as Sara said in the beginning, for you to share with colleagues. And once we get this session uploaded to YouTube, you're welcome to share and watch together. So really appreciate your time this afternoon, as we said, as we're creeping towards the end of the school year. Also really appreciate the support and partnership of all of our different professional organizations as we think about kind of working across content areas.